Once again, I welcome all participants. Thank you for showing interest in the development of events around Ukraine. These events, like ripples on water, are spreading wider and wider, having already engulfed all of Europe, and not only. Echoes are being felt on other continents too, which I will speak about today. The topic, as we agreed, is the role of the West in igniting the Ukrainian crisis and its destructive contribution, if one can put it that way, to current events. Regarding how the West, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, destroyed the principle of indivisible security, clearly enshrined in several summits of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, we have spoken before at our previous round tables. We noted in practical terms that instead of respecting their president's signatures under these obligations, not to strengthen their security at the expense of others, the West consistently expanded the military-political bloc of NATO to Russian borders and engaged in creating an arc of instability of Russophobic political regimes right on our borders with the goal of the strategic containment of our country. Special attention in this work was given to Ukraine. Neither money nor effort was spared to support Ukrainian nationalism, which has been known to the world since the Second World War for its particular cruelty. The West carefully nurtured outright Nazis, Russophobes, and anti-Semites in Ukraine who never hid their sympathies for Hitler, Nazi ideology, and symbols, and who took pride in the crimes of their predecessors during the Second World War against Russians, Belarusians, Jews, Poles, and representatives of other nationalities. The West supported the state coup in Kiev back in December 2004, when, in violation of the Constitution of Ukraine, it imposed a third round of elections. It is not provided for in the Constitution, and in this third round, colossal work was done to prevent the election of the one who won in the second round. And in the third round, the West pushed their man through. And of course, the West played a direct role in the second coup in February 2014, when, contrary to, I emphasize, the settlement agreement between the government and the opposition, an agreement guaranteed by Germany, France, and Poland, contrary to all this, power was seized by outright Nazis and Russophobes, who immediately proceeded to physically exterminate their fellow citizens in Donbass. Against civilians, trampling on all norms of international humanitarian law, the army, combat aviation, and outright criminals from nationalist battalions were deployed. At the same time, starting from 2004, Ukrainians were told from Brussels, "You must make a choice. Who are you with Europe or with Russia?" And this card, with us or against us, Westerners, by the way, cynically play in many other cases as well. It is exactly through such logic that in 2005, in Romania, when the election results were cancelled, they organized a revote and pushed a candidate acceptable to the West into the presidency. By the way, speaking of recent events, I will mention the congratulations from the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who sent a message to the Prime Minister of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan. I quote, "The spirit of the Velvet Revolution that you led in 2018 is alive and thriving. Yerevan can count on Europe." End quote. In other words, now, they are not just trying to change power by some underground methods, but are proud of the fact that they carry out color revolutions, velvet and otherwise. But returning to Ukraine, since 2015, Russia was firmly committed to the implementation of the Minsk package of measures, which was signed after months of attempts to stop the illegal war unleashed by the Kiev regime against its own people, and which was signed in Minsk after 17 hours of negotiations, and guaranteed, again, by Chancellor Merkel and French President Hollande. After the approval by the UN Security Council, it seemed to us that the West would nevertheless be committed to its obligations to force the Ukrainian regime to fulfill what this regime had signed and what was enshrined by the guarantees of the leading members of the European Union. But neither the West, nor these leading members, nor Kiev itself, thought about fulfilling this important document. And later, this was admitted, and with pride, by the former leaders of France, Germany, and Ukraine who signed the document. And so in 2021, when, clearly with the support of the West, the Ukrainian regime countered on solving the Donbass problem by force, simply seizing the territories that refused to accept the Nazi ideology of the putschists who came to power illegally, we then proposed to the West, NATO, and the United States to settle the fatal crisis of European security provoked by themselves through diplomatic means, by adopting, agreeing, and signing 2 treaties that were dedicated to ensuring balance in the field of security and to eliminating the risks of a direct armed conflict. At the same time, we raised the issue of formalizing these agreements with mutual legally binding guarantees. Our proposals were arrogantly rejected. We were told that Russia has no say in whether to admit Ukraine into the North Atlantic Alliance or not. Today, both Britain and the countries of the European Union continue to pump the Kiev regime with weapons and money, condone its frankly terrorist actions, and have even gone so far as to justify any criminal actions of the Kiev regime, in particular blaming Russia for the fact that Ukrainian drones repeatedly violate the borders of EU countries. Drones, including combat ones, with explosives that can lead to tragic consequences. But in the statement of the European Council of June 19th of this year, they met recently, it is explicitly stated, I quote, "Russia bears full responsibility for all consequences," referring to the fact that Ukrainian combat drones fly and fall on the territory of EU countries. In the same document, in the statement of the European Council, a claim is made that Europe should play a key role in the future settlement of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. What kind of role this refers to is anyone's guess, because a disorderly discussion on this topic is already underway in the media space. Following the meeting of the European Council, the head of this structure, Mr. Costa, expressed himself in the spirit that they say the time for negotiations with Russia has not yet come, but the European Union needs a diplomatic channel of communication with Moscow, as if there are no representatives of that same European Commission and ambassadors of all EU countries in Moscow. According to information from Politico, Costa's chief of staff, Mr. Pedro Lorti, contacted official representatives in Moscow twice in recent weeks. It is also reported that the leaders of France and Germany condemned the Portuguese, Mr. Costa, for attempts to establish contacts with Moscow regarding the Ukrainian settlement. In particular, President Macron stated that the European Union in principle cannot be a mediator because it supports Ukraine and has imposed sanctions against Russia. I leave this information on the conscience of Paris. I leave this statement on the conscience of Paris, which itself is probably not averse, secretly from Brussels and everyone else, to asking for discreet contacts with Moscow without any permission, while Mr. Costa is forbidden to do so. I am not saying that we are very interested in these contacts. We know their worth. I am simply illustrating how policy is developed in the European Union and how seriously one should take their constant statements that Russia must sit down at the negotiating table. We want to, but it doesn't want to. But we will sit down when we want. This is a complete mishmash, and here I wouldn't even pay attention to it, especially since Mr. Zelensky, who insists on negotiations, putting forward absolutely unrealistic and even boorish conditions, not only to Moscow, but also to his European curators, explicitly stated the other day that Europe should think about the format of negotiations and offer several possibilities, but Kyiv itself will determine who will be the negotiator from Europe. Comments are superfluous. A Fuhrer is a Fuhrer. He was appointed to the role of a Fuhrer, taken from amateur performances, but here you see this image turned out to be contagious. On this same topic, by the way, Ursula von der Leyen also noted, stating that supposedly the European Union should prepare for the start of negotiations with Moscow, but at the same time spoke out in favor of increasing sanctions pressure on our country and proudly welcomed the extension of EU restrictions against Russia no longer by 6 months, as was always the case, but by a year. These are just a few examples that characterize the position of the European Union, how serious this position is, and whether it can be seriously thought about at all. The European Union at the same time persistently claims to represent the entire West, including the United States, in all its actions, in its reasoning, and in its threats and promises regarding the problems of the Ukrainian conflict. At the same time, all the mentioned and many other figures of Brussels and European capitals are absolutely united in the fact that Europe does not intend to become an impartial mediator because it is on the side of Ukraine. And it is also stated that Europeans will under no circumstances abandon their support for Kiev even after the crisis. That is, they want to perpetuate the current regime. Therefore, when Europe, undiplomatically speaking, literally intrudes with its assessments of negotiations, insisting on its approaches and trampling on all those sprouts of common sense that the administration of Donald Trump showed after returning to the White House, we have no illusions regarding the real plans of the Europeans. I have already mentioned how they thwarted the results of negotiations in 2014, in 2015. I will also mention December 2019, when, at the initiative of President Macron, a meeting of that very Normandy 4 took place in Paris. President Putin, Zelensky, Chancellor Merkel, and President Macron were present. Then a document was adopted there that demanded the fulfillment of the Minsk agreements, and first of all, a ceasefire extending to the entire line of contact and agreeing on the special status of Donbass. Those very areas that were declared terrorists by the Kyiv regime and against which a war was unleashed. And this war continued, despite the adoption of the Minsk agreements. The Minsk agreements, in essence, left all of Donbass within Ukraine. Upon granting the residents of Donbass a special status, meaning, first of all, permission to speak the Russian language and have their own administrative structures. At the press conference in the G7 summit statement, I have not yet mentioned that all the signatures of our Western colleagues under the 2014 agreement, under the 2015 Minsk agreements, and under the 2019 Paris agreements, which Macron was so publicly proud of, all these signatures turned out to be empty, as we say, a fake. And after the start of the special military operation Europe, now in the person of London, which constantly wants to be associated with Europe and clearly wants to lead everyone there, derailed the achieved result of another round of negotiations between Russia and Ukraine in Istanbul in 2022. The Europeans did nothing when the contacts resumed in 2025 between Moscow and Kiev, both in Istanbul and in Abu Dhabi, were unilaterally interrupted by the Zelensky regime in the midst of discussing additional steps that would have allowed these negotiations to be made more productive. In general, we see the well-known games of bad and not so bad cop on the part of Europe. This does not change the essence. If we translate into plain language, everything we hear from Brussels, London, Paris, Berlin, and from other capitals, they are demanding capitulation from Moscow. This is exactly the essence of the statement by Macron, Starmer, and Merz after their gathering with Zelensky on June 7th in London. And a few days later, the ambassadors of these countries, as we reported, invited themselves to our foreign ministry only to confirm the London ultimatum. No proposals for anything else were voiced. In the statement of the G7 summit in Evian, there is again talk of unconditional support for the Kiev regime, of helping Kiev in strengthening its military potential, increasing the supply of Western weapons to it, and the need to strengthen sanctions against our country's economy. Words such as peace and settlement are not used in the G7 statement. At the press conference following this meeting in Evian, Macron spoke a lot about the comprehensive consolidation of the Group of Seven on an anti-Russian basis. He rejoiced that in Evian Europe was able to prove to Donald Trump the erroneousness of the agreements reached in Alaska in August 2025 and to change Washington's position. In other words, he boasted that he allegedly knocked the President of the United States off the road to peace and directed him onto the warpath. In exactly the same way, contrary to Trump's repeated statements about the inadmissibility of dragging Ukraine into NATO, Alliance Secretary General Rutte does not tire of repeating that NATO's doors remain open for Kyiv. In conditions when the Ukrainian armed forces daily lose positions on the battlefield, Europe makes a bet on the frankly terrorist methods of the Zelensky regime, encouraging it to strike civilian targets, including deep into Russian territory, including medical facilities, residential buildings, dormitories, colleges, and children's institutions in the hope of sowing discontent and panic and splitting Russian society. We understand this perfectly. The real goal of the West, under the cover of demands for negotiations, is the salvation of the Zelensky regime and the conservation of Ukraine as a bridgehead for continuing the fight against Russia. For this, they want to achieve an immediate ceasefire to stop the Russian offensive, to again, as in the period of the Minsk agreements, get a respite, buy time to pump the Kiev regime with new batches of modern weapons, and deploy occupation forces with an anti-Russian mandate on the territory controlled by Zelensky under the flag of the so-called coalition of the willing. The European Union acts as the ringleader here. As for the United States, as far as their actions can be assessed, they seem to be stepping away from the claim to the role of an objective mediator and are following the same course of increasing sanctions pressure on Russia. Already, in addition to the extension of all Biden's sanctions, a rather large package of sanctions by the Trump administration against Russia has been adopted. Forgotten is the statement of the President of the United States, made immediately after Anchorage, that Ukraine needs a long-term peace, not a truce for a couple of years, and that Alaska laid the foundation for movement in this direction. Literally yesterday, the U.S. Deputy Permanent Representative to the UN demanded an immediate ceasefire. Nothing more, he did not speak of any long-term settlement. Among other things, Washington, when discussing various international problems, has stated more than once that for it there are no restrictions in the form of international law, be it multilateral or bilateral treaties, and that the United States, as you know, had its own stated morality. They do not worry about international law in Europe either. They carry out the plunder of Russian gold and foreign exchange reserves, the introduction of secondary sanctions against Russia's trading partners, the blackmail of the countries of the global majority, especially the CIS and other neighbors of Russia, but also countries around the world. The EU and London proudly announced plans to supply Ukraine with new modern weapons, openly declaring the preparation of their participation in a war against Russia, threatening strikes on the Kaliningrad region and the Kola Peninsula. The Norwegian Ministry of Defense announced an agreement between Norway, Britain, and Germany on joint work to search for and destroy submarines in the North Atlantic. London and Paris intend to cobble together a European Security Council under their leadership, with the participation of the most zealous Russophobes from the European Union and, you guessed correctly, the Kiev regime. An European Commissioner for Defense, Kubilius, stated that since Ukraine's membership in NATO is impossible in the near future, and joining the European Union will also take time, it is necessary to discuss the possibility of closer integration of a certain group of states in the format of a defense union. If in the United States the Department of Defense has already been renamed the Department of War, let the planned European Defense Union also be called a Union of War. It will be more honest. In any case, Europe is once again becoming the main threat to international peace and security. Brussels, along with Paris, Berlin, and London, once again, like Hitler's Germany before the Second World War, are uniting the continent under the banners of neo-Nazism and Russophobia. This time, these banners are handed to Zelensky, pushing him into the vanguard of the war against Russia. It is telling that starting from 2022, the countries of the European Union and NATO vote against the annual resolution of the UN General Assembly on the inadmissibility of the glorification of Nazism. Before that time, until 2022, they bashfully abstained. And in today's situation, as you can see, Poland alone was outraged when Zelensky fell to his knees before the ashes of Hitler's henchmen, the Banderite executioner of Poles and Jews, Russians and Belarusians, at a solemn ceremony of reburying these ashes. The rest of the West remained silent about such a mockery of the memory of the victims of Nazism, and it remained silent by no means bashfully, but essentially encouragingly. It is telling that when President Nawrocki stripped Zelensky of Poland's highest order, in a sign of solidarity with the head of the regime, all previous presidents of Ukraine began to return their Polish orders. Poroshenko, Yushchenko, and even Kuchma, who during the years of his rule in the early 2000s was not publicly noticed aiding Nazi ideology. This means that in practice, Nazi racist attitudes have been harbored by the Kiev rulers for a long time. They simply hid them before. Esteemed colleagues, yesterday we marked a tragic date in the history of our country. 85 years since the date of the armed attack by Hitler's Germany on the Soviet Union. The enemy was defeated, but, as we are convinced, has not learned the lesson. The aggressive revanchism of the current European elites, who have once again set their sights on defeating our country, causes particular concern, and Berlin is marching in the front ranks, heading the course towards the militarization of the European Union, and officially proclaiming plans to make the German army the strongest in Europe once again. Once again is a highly telling word in this context. It is clear against whom the strike force of this German army will be directed. As the head of the Luftwaffe stated literally the other day, the German Air Force is ready to fight Russia even today. The current elites in Europe do not hide that they are preparing for war with us in the near future. Deadlines no later than 2030 are named, but the main thing is not the deadlines, but the essence. It was announced, for example, that the Netherlands is working out a scenario for creating camps for Russian prisoners of war on its territory in the event of a war with us. The very same concentration camps that Germany created in Europe during the Second World War. At the same time, it is openly admitted that Europe needs some more time for better quality preparation for a war with Russia. And the head of the Belgian General Staff, a couple of months ago, cynically stated, I quote, "We still have a few years, thanks to the blood of Ukrainians who are buying us this time." The West's attempts to take historic revenge are obvious. For the sake of this, the Kiev regime is permitted everything, including planting a cult of worship of Hitler's collaborators, a legislative ban on the Russian language in all spheres, and on the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church, in direct violation of the UN Charter, numerous international conventions, and the Constitution of Ukraine itself. Practically on the same day when Zelensky signed another Russophobic law, this time on the non-application of the European Charter for regional or minority languages to the Russian language, on that same day, Ursula von der Leyen proudly announced the opening of negotiations on the admission of Ukraine into the European Union, starting with the first negotiating chapter. This chapter, by coincidence, concerns the rule of law, democracy, and human rights. Neither in this regard, nor ever before, has a single word of criticism of Kiev for its policy in the field of those very human rights been voiced from Brussels and other European capitals. On the contrary, Brussels, London, Paris, and Berlin glorify the Zelensky regime as fighting for European values, thereby confirming upon what values the European Union is actually founded. It turns out that the modern European Union adheres to the values of Nazism. For another time in history, any truth about what is happening instantly becomes a taboo. There are many examples. Among the recent ones is the ban on the European publication Politico from publishing my article, contrary to an existing agreement. There is your freedom of speech. We, by the way, distributed the text of the article in the materials for today's meeting. I hope it will be useful to you. By the way, if we mention appearances in the press, then back in January 2018, 8 years ago, our newspaper, Kommersant, published my interview titled 2018. The charge of Russophobia is unprecedented. This interview contained warnings to the West against its aggressive plans, provided numerous examples of Russia's readiness to normalize relations with Europe on the basis of mutual respect and an honest balance of interests. Unfortunately, the long-standing manifestation of the goodwill of the Russian leadership, personally of President Putin, toward a détente of tensions that were explosively accumulating in the European Union and NATO towards Russia, was not reciprocated. As a result, we have the current situation, when any possibility of equitable negotiations is discarded by Brussels bureaucrats and their accomplices in Berlin, Paris, and London. I emphasize once again, they want revenge. They want Russia to capitulate and resign itself to the absorption of Ukraine, headed by the current Nazi regime, either by the North Atlantic Alliance or the European Union, and there is already no difference here. The degree of the West's obsession with the desire to defeat Russia is illustrated by the statistics of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. This is a Western organization. You know about this. For the purpose of increasing spending on Ukraine in 2025, the volumes of official aid to the world's poorest countries were reduced by more than 23%. All 5 leading donors, the USA, Germany, Britain, Japan, and France, limited their aid to the global south. They limited it due to the fact that they are increasing aid to Ukraine. Anyone can draw their own conclusions about the real priorities of the West. The West's complex of its own superiority manifests itself by no means only in its approaches to the Ukrainian crisis. The US, Britain, and Europe strive for total global domination, so that no one hinders them from continuing to pump out resources everywhere and living at the expense of others. Hence the task declared by Washington to take into its hands the global energy markets. In January, we witnessed an armed invasion of Venezuela by the US, with dozens killed and wounded. The president of the country and his wife were kidnapped. And Washington did not hide that this was primarily about gaining control over the Venezuelan oil industry. The unprovoked aggression by the US and Israel against Iran that followed in March seriously destabilized the situation not only in the Middle East, but in the world. And the other day, President Trump said that the US, in case negotiations fail, will take control of the Strait of Hormuz. And the talk again turns out to be about oil, and not about something else. And of course, neo-colonial pressure is openly applied now towards Cuba, with which we reaffirm our solidarity. The West entirely strives to establish its influence on the development of energy and transport routes in Central Asia and the South Caucasus. France is trying to overthrow the nationally oriented governments it does not like in the Sahara-Sahel countries and other parts of the African continent. At the same time, Paris relies not only on local separatists, but also on terrorist groups, as well as increasingly on militants of Ukrainian formations who decided to open a second front against Russia in Africa. In East Asia, where until recently everyone recognized the central role of ASEAN and the universal partnership mechanisms of cooperation created around this association, closed bloc troikas and quartets with a military slant are now being created, some even with a nuclear component. NATO is already declaring that, contrary to the statutory goal of defending the territory of its member countries, the alliance has the right to lead on the entire Eurasian continent as well, because they say threats to NATO members now come from the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, Southeast and Northeast Asia. A complex picture of the absorption of the entire Eurasian continent is emerging, starting from the West, preserving the Nazi regime in Ukraine, forming more and more new threats to Russia's security around it, forcing other post-Soviet states to follow the Western line, joining sanctions, and up to promoting Indo-Pacific strategies in the east of the continent, with the stated goal of containing China and Russia. To this line, as you know, we counterpose the concepts of an all-continental architecture of security, cooperation, an architecture open to all, without exception, countries located in Eurasia. This was discussed at the recent Russia-ASEAN summit in Kazan. We and our like-minded partners impose nothing on anyone. We only propose to start a serious conversation on all problems, on all conflicts of this largest continent in the world, on which position ultimately prevails, the subordination of all others to one center, or collective work, and the formation of a balance of interests. The future of the world order depends, without exaggeration. Russia and our partners in the CIS, CSTO, EAEU, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and other regional associations unequivocally choose the path of dialogue. They remain committed to those principles enshrined in the UN Charter following the defeat of Nazism and militarism during the Second World War. One cannot allow a revision of the results of this most bloody war in the history of mankind, and even more so, one cannot allow the revival of those forces of evil that unleashed it. The global majority must realize its responsibility in this matter, protect the UN Charter, and resist attempts to stop the objective historical process of forming a just, multipolar world order. I would like to note in conclusion that despite all the tricks of the European elites and their Kiev clients, all the goals and tasks of the special military operation will be achieved. It is necessary to ensure in practice the neutral, non-aligned, and nuclear-free status of Ukraine. Exactly such a status is enshrined in its Declaration of Independence, and it is precisely in this status that Russia and everyone else recognized the Ukrainian state. We must guarantee the abolition of discriminatory laws against the Russian language and canonical orthodoxy, recognize the new geopolitical realities based on the results of the free expression of the will of the population of Crimea, Donbas, and Novorossiya. President Putin, during his speech at the recent St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, when commenting at the request of journalists on the famous boorish message of Zelensky, addressed not the illegitimate ringleader of the Kiev junta, but the Russian soldiers and commanders on the line of combat contact. He said, "The whole country is looking at you. The whole country is proud of you and relies on you. Work, brothers. Work, brothers." These words were transmitted by radio many years ago. Before his death by our fighter, he was a Dagestani who was surrounded by a gang of terrorists in the Caucasus. In the end, those terrorists were destroyed. The same fate awaits their modern followers.
Наш боец, он дагестанец, которого окружила банда террористов на Кавказе. В итоге те террористы были уничтожены. Та же участь ждет и их современных последователей.